I'm Bob Knote, and welcome back to the Camp Chaos Chronicles. In this episode, we're going to take a look at these things, why they're necessary, and how I made them. Dang it. Now the fact is these things really aren't necessary. The only possible reason that you would build these things is if you spend a lot of time with your car on track. The fact is that these things will actually ruin your car for the on-street driving experience, because there's a lot of things that you got to do in addition to making these things that really kind of ruin the car for the street. On the track, that's different. So why do you need these for the track? Well, there's two reasons. First of all, you've got very heavy rubber mounts that hold the IRS into the car. And they're there, of course, as I mentioned earlier, to compensate for the trailing arm moving in this direction through an arc like this, and the lower control arm moving through an arc like this. So they're in conflict, and the IRS has to be mounted that way so that it can absorb that movement. Now the problem is that if you're on track with your car, you're going to be imparting a lot of load to this IRS unit that you wouldn't be just in street application. So I found that after 2 or 3 weekends, I jacked the rear end of my car up to work underneath, and I found that the IRS just about fell out of the car. It was being held in by the drive shaft, one of the subframe mounts, and the lower control arms. And these were older mounts, so they would have been prone to failure. However, I'm not sure the new mounts would have done a whole lot better. And in fact, the rear front subframe mounts had failed as well. So I found that during track use, this stuff has to be bolted up solid. And if you're going to use the stock trailing arms, you can't do that. Because remember that conflict between the trailing arm and the lower control arm? If you try to do that, you're going to break something. Something's got to break. It's like having one of the hinges on a door out of alignment. Something's going to break. So the two reasons: number one, so that the IRS doesn't fall out of your car when you're on track, and number two, in order to allow you to bolt everything up solid so that you can eliminate the bump steer and also not have to worry about your mounts. So let's take a look at how I did this. Now you're going to have to visualize that this is in the car and that none of this stuff is here. In the stock configuration, what you would see here would be a nut that attaches to the end of the inner fulcrum bolt that the lower control arm pivots on. So this wouldn't be here. So the first thing you need to do with this unit under the car is to take a tape measure and measure from that heavy washer right here out to a point on the chassis of the car where you think you're going to attach the lower control arm. And it just so happens that at a real convenient point, there is a channel that is part of the unibody of the vehicle that is upturning to go over the rear axle, which works really, really well. And it's right about here, which means that the lower control arm that you're going to fabricate isn't going to be that long, which is a good thing. So once you've got this measurement, then you can go ahead and set up a jig whereby you can start to fabricate these parts. Now once I've got the measurement from the front of the IRS cage to where I want to attach the front pivot to the subframe or the unibody of the vehicle, I went ahead and I made this fixture, and it's made out of 2 thicknesses of 3/4 inch medium density fiberboard. It's cheap, it's stable, worked perfectly. Now you notice I got 4 bolts here. These bolts were used to attach the fixture down to the top of my welding table, which is very, very flat. And if you remember from the welding bench video, I've got a grid of 1/2 by 13 thread bolt or holes threaded into the top of that welding bench for just this purpose, to fasten things down during fabrication. So up front here you can see where I've got some steel bushings that are at that distance from where the front cage is going to be when I actually mount it on here, and they're threaded to 5/8 fine thread just like the actual bolts are going to be. And so these are going to be used to locate the forward pivot. These 4 holes right here, they're countersunk from the back side, so I can run bolts up from the back side to the inner fulcrum bolt mounts on the bottom of the IRS. They bolt to the side of the IRS. This affixes the IRS to this fixture. You're going to have to use your imagination a little bit from this point on, because to take an entire unit and actually perform this operation would take a lot more time than I've got right now. So imagine, if you will, a complete IRS unit here. The differential is bolted to this form. It's located perfectly on this center line that I've got drawn on here. Because these holes are oriented as they should be, that the IRS is bolted to this with. And you can kind of see how this is starting to come together. Now, what I've done is I've taken the inner fulcrum bolt for the lower control arm that fits in here through this hole, and I've replaced it on this side with a piece of steel rod that is the same diameter as the fulcrum bolt. And you'll notice that on this end I've got a bushing that I have threaded or drilled to the same diameter on my lathe, and it's also got the same thread on it as the forward tie rod end on the trailing arm. So what I've done, and you can see that it's tapered here, what I did in the original installation was to force the pivot bolt out using this rod. It's going to slide in and slide out again without upsetting anything, because there's a lot of stuff between here and here. There's seals, there's bearings, there's collars, there's a bushing that goes in between the 2 ends of the control arm. It's really kind of it's not horrible, but it's work you don't want to do if you don't have to. So what we had then is both of these installed, as you see this one right here. And if you remember that measurement we took, that's the distance from there to the center of this tie rod end, or this spherical rod end that we've got threaded into the front of this spud right here. These collars that you see here, one collar is mounted on the front of the subframe, and then again the distance from the back end of this collar to the center of the spherical rod end, that's that measurement we took. And then the other collar is on the back side of the IRS cage, so that this thing doesn't move around. It's solid in place. What this enables us to do then is to take the subframe off of this fixture, put it underneath the car in its stock location, and we can then know exactly where this front mount for this forward spherical rod end needs to be. Now, as you can see, once we've got the IRS positioned properly with a forward spherical rod end of the new trailing arm in place, we can finalize the design on the forward mount. And as you can see here, it's simply a piece of square tubing that's been cut to the proper angle to make it work with the upward curving portion of the unibody at that point. And once we got that tacked in and everything seems to be correct, we can then go ahead and box it in and do the final welding on it. And you can see that there is a bushing that is let into the bottom side of this mount that the forward spherical rod end attach bolt is going to thread into, and in the end it all looked really, really good. However, it occurred to me that as this car is going to be accelerating and decelerating, the IRS is going to be pushing on this bolt fore and aft in shear, and what that could result in eventually is failure of either the bolt or the mount. And so what I decided to do was to mount a large tab to the chassis and bring it to the bottom side of the spherical rod end so that the bolt passes through it, through the spherical rod end, and then into the mount, thereby eliminating that fore and aft force on that bolt. And it's been working great. Now, once we've got that forward attach point all sorted out, then what we can do is we can take the IRS unit out of the car and bolt it back on the fixture. And we can now use this setup to fabricate the control arm itself. Now, in order to make this work, we got to come up with some way of attaching the fulcrum bolt to the trailing arm so that the trailing arm is free to move without the pivot bolt or the fulcrum bolt rotating on the inside, because this has to be bolted up solid in order to be able to have everything held in place on the inside of the cage here, because you got your control arm moving up and down here. So in order to do that, what I fabricated was a piece of steel out of 4130 chromoly round stock that on one end had the same thread as the forward end of the fulcrum bolt, and on the other end had the same thread as the spherical rod end that's going to be fitting into that. And there's a bunch of other things that needed to be fabricated, like the inserts that are going to go in the front of the trailing arm to accept the spherical rod end at that point. Also at this end out here, those are things that are going to be let into the ends of the two tubes that we're going to use to make the control arm with. And you can see them right here. We've got one here, and we got one right here. So we got those two, so that's 4 pieces, plus those spuds that are going to attach to the front of the fulcrum bolts. And in this fashion right here. Now, in order to allow this thing to rotate up and down, as we've mentioned, we've got to have spherical rod ends at these points. Now, another thing we should talk about is 2 different types of spherical rod ends that we've got that are going to allow the fabricated trailing arm to do what it does. Now, you notice we've got a standard rod end right here. It's fairly thin, and this is the one that is going to connect to the outboard end of the trailing arm. In fact, we really don't need to have a spherical rod end for this application. We could just have a clevis, because there's going to be no relative motion or movement between this end of the trailing arm and that end of the lower control arm. I wasn't even aware that these things existed at that point, and to be truthful, these things aren't that much less expensive than a good spherical rod end. So either way, it works. Now you'll notice though that this one on the inside, this one looks a lot different. It's got a bigger ball than the standard rod end, and it also has a couple of cylindrical projections, one on the top, one on the bottom. Now what this allows to happen, and by the way, this is called a high misalignment spherical rod end. What this allows is a lot more movement. Now here on the inboard end, right here, we're going to have a lot of travel of that spherical rod end as the suspension moves up and down. If we had one of these spherical rod ends here, we would end up with a conflict between this clevis right here and the spherical rod end. This rod end won't travel enough. So you have to use a high misalignment rod end at this point. Now we can begin to actually mock up the trailing arm that we've designed, and we've got that square clevis back here that we can attach to the high misalignment ball joint that attaches to the spud, that threads on to the fulcrum bolt of the lower control arm. We can design that tube that goes out to the end of the lower control arm, and the two tabs that are going to attach the lower control arm end to that spherical rod end at that point, and so forth. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on how to do that. That's fairly simple stuff. But the one thing we really need to be careful of at this point is that the trailing arm on the left side is identical to the trailing arm on the right side. And in order to make sure that that was the case, I fabricated another jig out of MDF using the left side as a template or a pattern in order to do that, and then cut the other one out and fabricated it so that it was identical. Now, the point being that if you've done everything right, everything that's on the left side should work on the right side, and it does. There's a little bit of variation to the point where I labeled one left and one right, and it basically was limited to just having to thread one spherical rod end out a little bit out at the end of the lower control arm, but that's enough so that I just labeled them left and right, and otherwise they were identical.
And as you can see how this works as I move the suspension through its travel. What that has essentially done is taken all the hinge points on the rear suspension and lined it up. It's kind of hard to see in the back there probably, but from the back point right there to this point right here to this point right here. And when you do that, it's like lining up all three hinges on a door, and what that enables you to do then is to bolt everything solid to the chassis in order to reduce the bump steer.
Now, I gotta say that if you're going to make a trailing arm setup like this with spherical rod ends, you also have to do this. You have to eliminate the rubber mounts up here, because if you let this subframe move around on the rubber mounts, you're going to tear those mounts out up at the front of the new trailing arms you've made. And then you got a bigger problem than just a little bump steer that you're trying to eliminate in the first place. Now, what I've done to eliminate the rubber mounts is bolted a couple of 3/16 steel plates on each side, make sure that the IRS unit is in the position that it was originally in, and then drilled the holes and bolted it up. Some people actually take the original rubber mounts, eliminate the rubber, and put some square or rectangular steel tube in between and weld it up. Again, if you bolted that up solid, you got to do the same thing here or you're going to break something. Now, one thing that I thought of during the course of filming this is what a person could do instead of putting the spherical rod end up front there, you could actually cut this bushing out of the end of your old trailing arms along with that rubber bushing right there, and you'd have to take this spud, which is rusted out of the original car here. You'd have to take this and actually put that in up front, and then you could actually keep your rubber mounts here, and you wouldn't absolutely ruin your car for the street. So I think you ought to try that and let us all know how that works out for you. If you like these videos, like, subscribe, follow us on Facebook, and leave a comment down below so that we can know what we can do to do what we do better. So we'll see you the next time on the Camp Chaos Chronicles.